Sometimes I wonder if we know what God is calling us to. Sometimes I wonder if we are truly aware of what it is that God is asking us to do, to be, or to become. I wonder if at times we read various insecurities that we have into the text, or various cultural pressures that we have received, or that we give, or that we value, that more reflect what it is the culture is saying than what it is that the text itself is saying. For example, this morning I was wrestling with Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25 comes right after the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, which you can listen to some of my online lectures on that if you want to know kind of what's happening there in Matthew 24. But in Matthew 25, we're in the middle of these 4 successive parable accounts. It ends chapter 24 with the parable of the wicked servant, then you have the parable of the 10 virgins, and then you have the parable of the talents. Now the chapter ends with the sheep and the goats, but the parable of the talents to me is interesting because of the way we typically translate it in American, more capitalistic type societies. The parable of the talents, if you don't know how the story goes, the parable of the talents is you have this man, this owner that is going on a journey, and he calls some servants together and he entrusts property to them. He gives one of the servants 5 talents, which would have been a very large amount of money. He entrusts another servant with 2 talents, and he trusts another servant with 1. And these large amounts of money, even 1 talent would have been an extreme amount of money. He entrusts them, and then he goes off on his journey. Now, it's upon his return that you have the one with 5 talents comes before the owner of the property, and he says, I took your 5 talents, and I actually increased it by 5 more. And the guy's like, you've got to be kidding me. That's incredible. 10 talents? Well done. Then the guy that comes up that had 2 talents says, and I've increased mine by 2 talents. I've doubled it as well. And he's like, well done, well done. And then you have this guy with the 1 talent that comes and he's like, I buried it in the ground. So here's your 1 back. And it ticks off the ruler. It ticks off the property owner. You wicked, lazy servant, verse 26. He says, basically, I wish you would have at least deposited into the bank so it would have received back some interest. But instead, you just buried it, and that's it. And typically how we apply this text is we say something like this. You've been given talents by the Lord. Make sure you don't waste it. Actually use all your talents in the world. Matter of fact, try to double everything you've been given for the Lord's sake. Now, hear me very clearly. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use all that we have to try to honor and glorify the Lord. I'm not saying that we shouldn't diligently utilize and increase and leverage whatever platforms, whatever advantages, whatever gifts we have been given for the kingdom. I 100% agree with that. Here's what I am saying. That's really not what this text is talking about. That's really not what ticks off the property owner. No, as a matter of fact, you have to go back to verse 24. The one that was entrusted with 1 talent, this is what he says. Then the man received, verse 24, then the man who had received the 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your talent in the ground. So here is what belongs to you. Now that's interesting. You see, the reason why, the motivation behind the one that had 1 talent, the motivation for him to bury it in the ground was that he knew that the master was evil. Matter of fact, he even accuses the master of stealing, that you harvest what you have not sown, that you gather where you have not scattered seed, that you take what isn't yours. Since I knew that was yours, and then, to follow it up, he says, and I was afraid. Since I was afraid of you and who you are, since you are wicked and evil and mean, I decided to save my own skin by burying it in the sand. And so then what you have is the master going, oh, so that's who you think I am. You wicked, lazy servant. Was he wicked and lazy because he didn't double his talents, or because he hadn't taken the time to get to know the master? You see, I think that the parable of the talents is saying this. Do you know who God is? Do you know who Jesus is? Because if you do know who God is, it would actually free you to give all that you have for the kingdom. But if you don't, if you have a fear-based relationship with God, one that accuses him of things that aren't even true, then ultimately you will not only do damage to the gifts you've been given, but you will have a disconnect between you and God where you will actually accuse him of things he never truly did. This reminds me of Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1 is one of the most vicious passages in the entire Bible, truthfully. Isaiah chapter 1, God is speaking to the nation of Israel. And he looks at them and he says in verse 10, Isaiah 1:10, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom." He's talking to Israel. "Listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah." He is talking to Israel. These are not good things to be called by God. "The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to meet me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings." Kind of reminds me of the meaningless offering of the parable of the talents. But let's not stretch it. Let's just keep going. "Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your evil assemblies. Your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts, my soul hates." This is intense. The Lord is not happy with them. He says that your festivals, your worship has become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I will not listen. Why? Because your hands are full of blood. Wash and make them clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing what is wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. Defend the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Now, it's easy to look at a text like this and say, see, we need to be doing justice ministries. Otherwise, God gets upset. Now hear me. I'm actually all for justice ministries, and I think it's very close to the heart of God. But that's not what Isaiah 1 is upset about. That's not what Isaiah 1 is challenging us with. As a matter of fact, Isaiah chapter 1 begins, the frustration with the nation of Israel begins in verses 2 and 3. And listen to what it says. "Hear, O heavens, listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. They do not know me. The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manger, but Israel does not know me. My people do not understand me." You see, the problem with Israel in Isaiah 1 is the same problem in Matthew 25 with the person with 1 talent. The problem is this: they do not know the master. And here's a question I want us to wrestle with this week. What more would God have needed to do in order for us to know who he is? Give us the law, write down things in a text so that we know exactly what he is saying, maybe become flesh and to teach us himself, maybe give us 1/3 of the Trinity to live inside of us. Like, what would he need to do to communicate to us who he is? The answer is, God has stopped at nothing to communicate who he is. But the real question is, do we know him? And if we do, it probably affects the way in which you do quite a few things. Love you guys. See you next week.